Hey folks, so we didn't get an opportunity to talk about Angular services and factories today, so I'm just going to do a really brief kind of overview of what Angular services are and how they can be helpful. So if you Google the Angular docs for services, it says Angular services are substitutable objects that are wired together using dependency injection. You can use services to organize and share code across your app. So that's really the great benefit and one of the great use cases for a service is if we have code that we want to share between controllers, for example, a service is a great way to encapsulate and modularize that code that we can then inject into other controllers and other parts of our app. Now, Angular offers several useful services like $HTTP, but for most applications, you'll also want to create your own. So we've dealt with a couple of different services, $HTTP. We dealt with UI router today. We dealt with a couple of $services. So Angular does have some built in, obviously, but we're going to see how we can create our own to modularize our code. So for this example, I am going to use the Museum app, which was a lab that we did on our Intro to Angular day. So it was earlier this week, week 8, day 2 in your Student Labs folder. I'm going to use this Museum app solution as some sample code to add a service to this application. And the reason I want to use this app is because if we go to the public JS folder, I have 3 controllers that are driving this one view. So if we look at the view here, we have 3 controllers that are controlling different portions of our app. So here's the exhibit controller, the general info controller rather, and then down here we have our donor controller. So if I have some piece of code that I would want to share between all 3 controllers, creating a service would be a great way to share that code between these controllers. So let's take a look at a very quick, rather contrived example. So the first thing I'm going to do is inside my JavaScript folder, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call this Schmitty service. This is a really contrived example. So here's my file. The first thing I want to make sure that I do is I want to make sure that I bring it in via a script tag into my index.html. So we want to make sure that our app knows about this file and loads it up. So I'm going to let it know about Schmitty service. Did I spell that right? SCH. Here we go. SCH. So schmittyservice.js, we're going to bring that file in, which will be awesome. And inside here, let me go ahead and add our iffy, which we were playing around with this week. And I already have the module, the Angular app, kind of declared here. So it's called the Met. So I'm going to be adding a service to that module. I'm going to go Angular module, the Met. So I'm going to bring that in. And then down here, I'm going to attach a service to this module. So earlier today, we played around with the .config to configure a router. We also looked at .directive when we're looking at custom directives. We've also used .controller and such. So now we're going to use .service. And kind of the pattern here is I need to declare the name of the service as a string. I'm just going to call this Schmitty service. And then I pass in as a second argument the function that I'm going to kind of declare to put the logic inside. So down here, I'm going to create a function called Schmitty service, and this is where we'll put our service information. I'm going to keep this really simple. So since this is an object, I can call this on it, and I'm just going to create a name property. Well, I'll put a greeting rather. And I'll make this equal to hello, this is Schmitty. Now, this greeting property is now a part of Schmitty service. So now I can essentially call Schmitty service.greeting and have access to the string that says hello, this is Schmitty. So I've created the Schmitty service. Let me open up a new pane down here. Let's start with the general info controller. So let's say that I want to inject the Schmitty service greeting down here in the general info area. So I'm going to open up my general info controller, and what I need to do is I need to inject it into my controller so that I have access to it. And inside here, inside my general info controller, I'm going to make a property on general info controller called this.greeting. And I'm going to make this.greeting equal to the greeting inside Schmitty service, or Schmitty service.greeting. So it's a little bit of a contrived example, but now I'm going to grab the greeting from Schmitty service and attach it to this.greeting, which is now a part of the general info controller. And now if I go into my index.html and I go to the part of the HTML that the general info controller manages, so right here in this section, I'm going to put just an H1, and I will put now, I'm going to look for info, because now info is the alias for general info controller. Now I'm going to call info.greeting, which is essentially that property right there. So if I put info.greeting, I can't even spell that right. Info.greeting, now if I refresh my browser, my file is not found. Let me reload it. So now if I refresh, I have this nice H1, hello, this is Schmitty. So pretty impressive, right? But the idea is that we partitioned out, we encapsulated some code inside of a service, then we inject it into our controller. And this is a great way to share code between controllers. So let me show with one other example. So I just injected it into general info controller. What if I also want to inject this into donor controller, let's say? So it's pretty much the same process. I can do Schmitty service, and here in donor controller, let me also define a this.greeting. And again, I'm going to make this equal to Schmitty service.greeting. So now I'm grabbing in both my general info controller and my donor controller, I'm still referencing this Schmitty service.greeting. So I can share that greeting property in both of my controllers. So now if I go back into my index.html, let me go into the donor controller area, the ng controller, which is down here at the bottom. So here's my ng controller, donor controller is donors. So now let me put an H1 down here, and for this one the alias is donors, so that's my donor controller. So I'm going to go donors.greeting, and we should see the same behavior here. So if I refresh, so there we go. So now I'm sharing that service. I can put it into my donor controller or my general info controller, and then I could also put it into my exhibit controller, obviously. So it's kind of a contrived example, but the point being, if there is code that we want to share between controllers or between parts of our application, putting that code into a service and sharing it that way is much more dry than writing a bunch of code, writing a bunch of the same code in each of these controllers. Why don't I just put that into a service and then inject that service into my various controllers?